So last time we left off, we finished talking about the herpes viruses. Remember, there are 8 known human herpes viruses. You need to be familiar with all 8, and they're very common. Remember, most of us are infected with multiple herpes viruses. We got infected mostly when we were children because those viruses are easily spread, especially through saliva. So we all have herpes of one kind or another. Moving on to the Hypnoviridae or Hepadnaviridae family. And when you see that word hepadna or hypno, what do you think of? What does that word say to you? Hepadna. Oh, it says hepatitis, but the word specifically makes you think about what organ? The liver, right? The liver. So here we see the first of several hepatitis viruses, hepatitis B, but all the other hepatitis viruses are actually in different families. So only one hepatitis virus here that's important comes from the Hepadnaviridae. And that's hepatitis B, which does use reverse transcriptase, so it has to carry that enzyme with it. And we've all been vaccinated against hepatitis B, but it's especially important if you're going into healthcare that you make sure that you were vaccinated against hepatitis B and are protected, since hepatitis B is transmitted through bodily fluids and it can cause severe liver damage. Now, the Calciviridae family has another hepatitis virus, hepatitis E, which we'll just mention because it's not a major one, but just to reinforce the idea that all the hepatitis viruses come from different families, not the same one. But norovirus or Norwalk agents are important because they make a lot of people sick every year. And these viruses cause severe gastroenteritis, especially nausea and vomiting. Also some diarrhea, but it's a lot of nausea and vomiting. You may have heard of cruise ship virus because there have been multiple outbreaks on cruise ships of noroviruses, and they make you very sick. You feel terrible. You can't eat, right, because you're so nauseous and vomiting. And if you're lucky, symptoms may only last a couple days. If not, they may last a lot longer, 5 days or more. And these are common. You do hear about them periodically on the news, as I said, on cruise ships or sometimes in hotels, things like that, because these viruses are very tough, hardy viruses. They can last on surfaces for long periods of time. And if you happen to pick up one of these viruses and then you stick your fingers in your mouth, or if you handle food, then that's how you get infected, by swallowing this virus. It is also transmitted through food and water, from someone who's infected, contaminating those products, and then you eat them and you get sick. It's extremely unpleasant. I know from personal experience because I've had it. I was so sick, so nauseous, I did have to go get IV fluids just because I was so dehydrated. But I also vomited so many times that I tore my esophagus. So that's how nasty this can be. And there's nothing you can do except wash your hands, because hand sanitizer does not work against these viruses. They've done experiments where the virus can last for months in water and it's still infectious. And there's no vaccine, and probably never will be, because the viruses mutate so much. So all you can do is wash your hands, try not to handle food with your bare hands unless you've washed your hands first, and hope the person who prepared your food has washed their hands, because even after you recover and you feel, perfectly fine, you're still infectious for at least a week afterwards, and you're shedding the virus. So it's possible for someone who had it but feels perfectly healthy is actually still infectious. So that's one of the things. It's just a very unpleasant virus. Now, the Flaviviridae family, we have hepatitis C. So another important hepatitis virus. You may have heard this. They do advertise on TV because there is no vaccine for hepatitis C, but there is a cure. There are antiviral drugs that you can take which can cure you of hepatitis C. And that's a good thing because most people with hepatitis C do not know they have it because you don't get symptoms for a long period of time. It may be 20 years before you show symptoms, and at that point, that means your liver has been damaged. You can go get tested for hepatitis C to see if you've got it, and then take the antiviral cocktail to get cured of it. But hepatitis C is also transmitted through bodily fluids. Most people don't know they have it because they don't manifest symptoms for a long period of time. Now, the arboviruses, these are important because many of them are transmitted by mosquitoes. And I'll just mention yellow fever and dengue fever here because these are tropical diseases transmitted by mosquitoes. But as the climate gets warmer, the tropical diseases are going to migrate northward. And so they are going to become problems in the United States eventually. St. Louis encephalitis virus and West Nile viruses are two closely related viruses that we're going to talk about. You hear the news media talk about West Nile virus every summer, and the reason why is because West Nile is still relatively new to the United States. It's not a new virus, it was just new to the United States. We never used to have it, and now we do. But we've had St. Louis encephalitis virus for a very long time. And there's not much concern about that, right? Because St. Louis encephalitis is the most common mosquito-borne illness in the United States. So St. Louis encephalitis is relatively common as far as mosquito-transmitted diseases are concerned, but it's not a serious infection. Most people will never even know they had it. And if you do have it, you get very non-specific symptoms like, headaches, fever, stiff neck. So, this could be caused by a bunch of different things. So most people, if they get infected, will never even know they were infected. If they are infected, they have very mild symptoms. But in certain rare cases, it's possible. If you're really young or really old or immunocompromised, you could develop a more severe encephalitis. But since less than 1% of these infections are clinically apparent, that means there's no symptoms, it's really not anything to worry much about. But there is a potential risk, but it's very, very low. And there is no vaccine. It's sort of a similar situation for West Nile virus, a closely related virus. Again, if you're really old or really young or immunocompromised, it could be potentially severe, but most people will have mild or no symptoms at all that they know of. And if you do, again, there are things like, headache, rash, swollen lymph nodes, maybe some GI problems, pain in the eyes, muscles, and back. But these can all be caused by different things as well. So again, most people will not suffer any serious consequences from West Nile, but there is the potential for encephalitis, which could be fatal, but that's pretty rare. So when it comes to mosquitoes in general, remember we talked about this, you should try to protect yourself from mosquito bites, wear repellent, long sleeves, long pants, avoid dusk and dawn. If there's any standing water on your property, make sure you dump it out so you don't create a place where mosquitoes can breed and reproduce. But we do talk about West Nile because it's relatively new to the United States. And now the Filoviridae family is a scary one. And this family contains Ebola and the closely related Marburg viruses. So we've all heard of Ebola, right? Yes, we know of Ebola, right? Because there was a fairly significant outbreak, potentially called an epidemic in West Africa several years ago. And there are still cases of Ebola happening in West Africa today. But the thing about Ebola is we learned that it did not stay in Africa, right? We had cases in the United States and in other parts of the world. So Ebola is something that we need to pay attention to because there are several different strains of Ebola. The most common one, Ebola Zaire, is the one that's the most lethal. Depending upon where you live and what medical care you can get, it can be as high as 95% fatal. Now, back in the 90s, when there was a lot of discussion of Ebola, and a book was written of the hot zone. One of the descriptions that was common back then, which turned out not to be correct, was that Ebola caused your internal organs to liquefy. That was not true. Ebola does cause a lot of internal bleeding, so it does damage the blood vessels and cause a lot of bleeding. And so patients would bleed out of their eyes, ears, nose, anus, so it just kind of looked like they were liquefying, but it was just a lot of bleeding that was happening. And then you had the black vomit. When blood enters the stomach, it turns dark and looks kind of like coffee grounds. And so people with the black vomit were vomiting what looked like coffee grounds, but it was blood. And that was one of the characteristics of Ebola infection. And so, it is a serious disease. We're working on vaccines. I don't know if they have a truly effective one yet, but they were close. And there are some antiviral drugs that also help, as well as antibodies. So a person who was infected with Ebola but recovered, they do have antibodies, and those antibodies have been used to treat other Ebola patients, and it can be very effective. So now Ebola did make its way to the United States a while ago, and there was a research facility in Reston, Virginia. I believe it was back in the 90s, and they had imported monkeys. And so they got different shipments of monkeys from different places. And the monkeys were kept in different labs, so they were separated. They never came in contact with each other. But one set of monkeys, they started dying, and they had Ebola. And then other monkeys in another lab, they started to die with Ebola. And that led to a very scary suspicion. And the suspicion was that Ebola had mutated to become airborne, because Ebola is transmitted through bodily fluids, and that does include sweat. So touching the skin of an Ebola patient is dangerous. You can get infected that way. But bodily fluids is the primary mode of transmission. And because these monkeys were dying, and these monkeys had never come in contact with each other, the researchers suspected that Ebola had mutated to become airborne. So consider this. Reston, Virginia, it's next to Washington, D.C., a densely populated city. What would have happened if we had a virulent airborne strain of Ebola in a densely populated city? It would have been catastrophic, right? But fortunately, that's not what happened. Ebola did mutate, but it was not airborne. Ebola mutated and was actually non-lethal to humans. It was killing monkeys, but it was not fatal to humans. And we actually call that strain Reston Ebola virus, named after Reston, Virginia, where it was discovered. So we have our own strain of Ebola, which fortunately is not really harmful to people. Several lab technicians did test positive for Ebola because they did get sick, but not seriously ill. And so, we dodged a bullet. We got very lucky, right? Because what would have happened if we'd had a lethal airborne strain of Ebola in a densely populated city? It just would have been a nightmare, but that did not happen. And fortunately, there have never been any major epidemics or pandemics of Ebola, because you do have to transmit it through bodily fluids. So that helps to limit, the spread of Ebola. Now, Marburg is named after Marburg, Germany. And I believe this was back in the 60s, where again, a research lab had brought in monkeys. Only this time, lab technicians got sick, and they died horribly. And from the time they presented symptoms, they were dead within a week. And so nobody knew what was going on. But fortunately, it just kind of burned itself out. It never spread beyond that research facility in Marburg, and it just disappeared completely. Later did they discover that it was closely related to Ebola. So we have dodged some bullets. Ebola is nasty, it's scary, it's something we need to worry about. Hopefully they'll have a really good vaccine soon, because they've been doing a lot of research in that. Antibodies are very effective, so we will have some very effective treatments for Ebola hopefully soon, and then it won't be the scary virus that it really is. But that's Ebola. Moving on to influenza. Again, most people consider influenza just to be a nuisance. It's just a really bad cold. Nobody really worries too much about it. Well, we should be worried. And the reason why is, on average, Ebola kills between 20,000 and 40,000 people in the United States alone. In a really bad flu season, it could be as high as 60,000 people. And that's a lot of people. And yet, most people are like, whatever, no big deal. I'm not going to get a flu shot. But there is a risk, a very high risk, especially if you're really old or really young or have some pre-existing medical condition. But there are three major types of influenza viruses, A, B, and C. And when it comes to typing and naming the different strains, they use two proteins, hemagglutinin and neuraminidase. So you may recall hearing about flu strains like H1N1, H2N5. So they're named based on the type of hemagglutinin and neuraminidase proteins they have. Hemagglutinin is used by the viruses to attach to host cells, and then neuraminidase is an enzyme these viruses use to help get released from host cells so they can spread. So that's how we type them. Now, when it comes to vaccines, have we all gotten our flu vaccine this year? Yeah. Well, it is important. I know some people don't like to get the flu shot. They ran out. Well, hopefully, because people are socially distancing and wearing masks, we'll have a mild flu season this year. That's my hope. But when it comes to the flu vaccine typically contains 3 strains of the flu virus, although sometimes they include a 4th strain, a sort of high-risk strain that they were dealing with several years ago. But at least 3 strains. And what they have to do is they have to look to Asia, Southeast Asia, and see what flu viruses are circulating there. And then they make their best guess as to which of those strains will make it to the United States, during our winter flu season. And the reason why they have to guess is because it takes 8 to 10 months to make flu vaccine. And so in order to be ready, to start administering the vaccine in September, they have to look back, in January and February to see what particular strains are circulating most commonly in Southeast Asia. Some years they guess right, some years they guess wrong. But it's still, better to get a flu shot than to not get a flu shot, especially if you have a job where you interact with a lot of people, like how it used to be before we switched to remote, teaching and learning. And so that's why flu shots are important. Now, have we all heard of the Spanish flu? Or maybe the 1918 flu? Yeah, so hopefully you have. That was the last major pandemic that the world experienced, was in 1918. And it was an influenza pandemic. And the reason why it was called the Spanish flu, it had nothing to do with Spain or Hispanics. It's just that in 1918, World War I was occurring. And Europe had a news blackout, so they were not releasing information, but Spain was. And so Spain was talking about this terrible flu, right, that was going around and killing people. And so that's how it got the name Spanish flu, just because we were getting news reports from Spain and not from any other European country. The exact origin is not known as to where it came from specifically, but it was a very, very deadly flu. It's estimated to have killed anywhere from 50 million to 100 million people all over the world. And back in 1918, the world population was less than 2 billion. So we're at almost 8 billion now. So scale up that number, we're talking about huge numbers of deaths. And the pattern of death was very different. Normally, flu kills the very old or the very young or people with a pre-existing condition, which, by the way, includes pregnancy. So that's why all pregnant women or women planning on becoming pregnant are urged to get their flu shot, because being pregnant increases your risk of death from the flu. But the normal trend is for the very old or the very young or people with some kind of pre-existing condition. Those are the ones that most commonly die, not the 1918 flu. In fact, if you were young and healthy, you were more likely to die of the 1918 flu. If you were really old or really young, you were more likely to survive the 1918 flu. So that is completely the opposite of the normal death pattern that occurs with the flu. And so the reason why they think that is that if you were young and strong and healthy, especially if you had a strong immune system, that's what killed you, was your immune system. So when we talk about the immune system, we are going to learn that as the immune system is fighting, it sometimes does incidental host damage. So when we talk about the immune system, we will talk about it as a war. It's a war for survival. And your immune system is using everything it has to destroy that invading pathogen. And sometimes friendly fire occurs. So the immune system does damage to your cells and tissues. With the flu, the damage occurs in the lungs. And what they believe happens is called a cytokine storm. And so cytokines are chemical mediators produced by the immune system. And the function of the cytokines is to stimulate the immune system. But if too much, of the cytokines is released, that causes a lot of inflammation. And when that happens in the lungs, that causes damage. And then the lungs leak and they fill with fluid. And so those patients actually suffocated to death. They drowned in their own fluids. So if you were young and strong and healthy, your immune system killed you because it did so much damage to your lungs filled with fluid and you died. But if you were really old or really young, you had a weaker immune system. So there was less lung damage, so you were more likely to survive. So that is not the typical, pattern, right? But that's what happened with the 1918 flu pandemic. And it's estimated that well over 600,000 people in the United States died from the flu in 1918 and 1919. In fact, World War II, most US soldiers died from the flu, not from the Germans. So most of our soldiers died from the flu during World War II, not the enemy. So it was a very devastating and deadly pandemic. And there's an excellent program that was done on it, and you can find this online. So it's a PBS American Experience video on the 1918 flu pandemic. So I strongly urge you in your spare time just to look it up, find it and watch it because it's excellent. And it talks about things that will sound very familiar today. So they did some of the same things in 1918 that we're doing now. And they had problems with compliance back then, just as we're having problems with compliance right now. But the flu was potentially very dangerous, although they have sequenced the genome of the 1918 flu because dead bodies up in Alaska were buried in the permafrost, and so they were preserved because of the cold. And so they were actually able to sequence the genome, and it turned out to be unremarkable. And so what they suspect is that the particular antigens on the surface of the virus are what we call superantigens, which just cause an overreaction by the immune system. And so they simply believe that those particular antigens cause the immune system to overreact so strongly. That's what led to the high number of deaths in healthy people.
A question.
Uh-huh.
I guess I should probably wait till we talk about COVID, but how come some viruses, like using the antibodies, are successful, and in COVID, I feel like they're so unsure about the antibodies.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that in COVID, so yeah, we'll get to that later. Okay, but we'll talk about that, but we'll get to that later. So influenza is what I call a promiscuous virus because it can infect more than one kind of host. And the most common hosts are pigs, birds, and humans. And in Southeast Asia, especially, there's a lot of pig farmers, a lot of chicken farmers, and so people are in very close contact with these animals. And so these viruses get shared back and forth. And viruses, they do mutate at a regular rate. And so that's why vaccines need to be administered every year, is because the viruses do mutate and change. And we call that regular rate of mutation antigenic or genetic drift. So drift is the regular rate of mutation. And so it takes about 3 years, for flu viruses and just many viruses in general to mutate and change just enough so your immune system has to respond all over again and create new antibodies. Because the antibodies you already have from every viral infection, colds, flus that you've had your entire life, you have antibodies and you're immune to those colds and flu viruses, but you're immune to that exact strain. In about 3 years, that strain is mutated just enough so those antibodies no longer work, which is why we get sick all over again and have to make more antibodies. And probably will for the rest of our lives because viruses constantly mutate and they just have to change just enough so the antibodies you have are no good and you got to make more, which means you got to get sick all over again. Same problem with vaccines. The viruses mutate, and so we have to create a new vaccine every year. Now, in order to create a really nasty flu strain, you require co-infection of an animal with more than one flu virus. So let's say a pig, for example. So a pig gets infected with 2 different flu strains. And so the same cell gets infected with those 2 different flu strains. During the process of replication, genes get mixed up. And so what we get is a rearrangement of the genome of the flu virus. And those tend to create the nasty strains of flus because you're basically creating a new form of flu virus. In that case, we call that antigenic shift. So antigenic shift is a radical rearrangement of the viral genome to create a new virus. And that's how we get the especially nasty strains of the flu. like the 1918 flu. And so doctors and scientists have been worried for decades that another flu pandemic was going to strike. Well, they were almost right. It's not the flu, it's COVID-19. It's the coronavirus. But there's absolutely no reason why a deadly flu pandemic cannot erupt next year or the year after. We just have to be vigilant and take the flu seriously. Hopefully, after coronavirus, we will take the flu more seriously. I just want to mention for HIV, we have a separate lecture, so I will go into this in more detail later. But HIV is an RNA virus. It must use a reverse transcriptase, right? It's got to carry it with it. But we'll talk more about HIV later. And so what do we do to deal with all these nasty viruses? Well, we rely on our immune systems for most of these. Assuming you survive, you will be immune to that particular strain of that particular virus. But in about 3 years or so, that virus is going to mutate just enough that your immunity is no good, and you have to get sick all over again. Or we can make vaccines, which are made from pieces of viruses or dead viruses, viruses that have been inactivated. Certain vaccines use live weakened viruses, but that's not very common because it is a live virus, so potentially it could cause an infection. One example, which is no longer used, the flu mist, flu vaccine, where they sprayed it up your nose. It was a live weakened virus, and so that's why there was an age limit. You couldn't be too old or too young, right, to get it because it could cause an infection. But it turned out that the flu mist really did not work or work very well at all. So they stopped using it altogether. So we're back to needles in the arm. And by the way, you cannot get the flu from the flu shot. There is no live virus in the flu vaccine, so you cannot get the flu from a flu shot. I know some people who say, oh, I get sick right after I get a flu shot. There are lots of different respiratory viruses out there during the wintertime, lots that cause colds. And the flu vaccine only protects you against 3 or 4 specific strains of the flu. There could be other strains, right? So there's lots of reasons why you can get sick after the flu shot, but it's not caused by the flu shot. There is no live virus in a flu vaccine. We do have antiviral drugs, which we've talked about. They're not antibiotics. And remember, the concern is we should only use them when absolutely necessary, because the more we use these antiviral drugs, the more resistant the viruses will become. And we just don't have that many good ones that we can use. So, and don't worry about Draco or the rest of that stuff. But any questions about animal viruses?
So if someone gets like quote unquote sick after they get a flu shot, it's something else. It's not from the shot.
It's something else. And there's lots of cold viruses during the wintertime too. And the flu vaccine only protects against those strains that are in the vaccine, not anything else, right? So people think, oh, I get a flu shot, I'm not going to get sick at all this year. It's like, no, you can still get lots of different colds, right? But the flu vaccine is only for those particular flu strains.
Got it, thanks.
I know there's always people that say that, but it's like you cannot get the flu from a flu shot. And it's possible you were already infected before you got the flu shot, right? Because you don't show symptoms for up to 3 days after you're infected with the flu. So you may have already been infected before you got the flu shot. And it takes 7 to 10 days to make antibodies. So you haven't had time. So you may have already been sick, but had no symptoms. And then you got symptoms right after because you were sick right before you got the shot. But you don't get the flu from the flu vaccine. Any other questions or comments? I'm sure most of you did not get a flu shot. It's not too late. Go get it while you can.
How do they get so many viruses enough for like everyone to get a flu shot?
Oh, they use millions of chicken eggs. in order to grow the vaccine. So well, there are more than one lab that makes them, but they do that. They know how to make the flu vaccine, so it's a standard protocol they follow. So it's pretty easy to make it, and they just have to change which type of flu they're using every year. But they've been doing that for a long time, so it's a pretty straightforward procedure, and the labs are all scaled up and ready to go to make that flu vaccine every single year. And so, when it comes to creating a new vaccine, the problem is that it does generally take 5 to 10 years, right, to develop a new vaccine for approval. And we're trying to do this all in less than a year. And so that raises some concerns, right? Because normally we do spend 5 to 10 years creating a new vaccine for something. And we're trying to do a coronavirus vaccine in a year or less. But it's not going to be ready by the end of this year, at least not ready for distribution, right? Because once they have a vaccine, they've got to mass produce it, they've got to ship it out, it's got to be administered. So don't expect anything like that to be ready or completed until next summer. Summer 2021, maybe, right? We'll all be vaccinated by then, assuming they've got a good vaccine that works. Anything else? Okay, we're going to change gears now and talk about COVID. So obviously the statistics are constantly changing. So the last time I updated this was Friday. But we're going to talk about coronaviruses and the three important ones, which are SARS coronavirus 1, SARS coronavirus 2, and MERS, because they're all very closely related viruses. So SARS coronavirus 1 stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus 1, also known as SARS. SARS coronavirus 2 is Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus number 2, also known as COVID-19, which stands for coronavirus disease that occurred in 2019. So COVID is SARS. It's just SARS number 2. And they're very closely related, SARS-1 and SARS-2. And MERS is the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, also known as the camel flu. So the coronaviridae family is where we find all the coronaviruses. They are RNA viruses, and they're positive stranded RNA, which have a 5' cap and a polyadenine tail. Does that sound familiar? A 5' cap and a polyadenine tail?
The eukaryotic, don't we have that too?
Yep. Eukaryotic messenger RNAs are modified with a 5' cap and a polyadenine tail as a way to stabilize them, right? Because they have to be transported from nucleus to cytoplasm. And so having a cap and a tail helps to stabilize those RNAs. So when the RNA genome is created in the eukaryotic host cell, it's a positive stranded 5' cap and polyadenine tailed messenger RNA. So that's the genome. And the coronaviruses are surrounded by a lipid membrane. Where did that come from?
From the host cell?
Yep, from the host cell, right? From budding or exocytosis. So the coronaviruses steal host membrane. So coronaviruses do cause respiratory infections, both mild and severe. And coronaviruses are one type of virus that can cause colds. So it's very possible during your lifetime one of the colds that you had was caused by a coronavirus. Most commonly, colds are caused by rhinoviruses, but they can also be caused by adenoviruses and coronaviruses. So there are many viruses that cause colds or, simple respiratory infections. But they do believe that, like in China, because they do get a lot of colds caused by coronaviruses, that may be providing some protection and limiting the infection rate and the death rate. So SARS-1 is considered an outbreak. It occurred between 2002 and 2004. More than 8,000 people were infected worldwide. More than 700 of them died, and that's approximately 10%, which is an extremely high death rate. I mean, some people might think, oh, yeah, 10%, that's not so bad. No, that's really, really high. You do not want any disease with a 10% death rate. 29 countries or territories had confirmed cases, but the overwhelming majority occurred in Asia, right? Around 7,500 were in China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. The US did have 27 cases of SARS, but no deaths. SARS-1 is believed to have come from horseshoe bats, which were transmitted to Asian palm civets, and we'll look at a picture of that next, and then to humans. And the problem is these wet markets, as they're called, where they have, open markets with live animals in cages and things, which you can, pick out the one you want to have killed and slaughtered for you. And so they believe that that's how these viruses are being transmitted to people. Here we have an Asian palm civet. It's actually kind of a cute little animal. Some people think it kind of looks like a cat, but it's actually more related to a mongoose. And so the palm civets get infected from bats, and then people handle the palm civets. Maybe it sneezes on you, or as you're cutting it up, you get infected from the blood. But that's how they believe that humans contracted SARS. MERS is still considered just to be an outbreak. It started in 2012, and it exists today. Only about 2,500 people have been infected worldwide, but over 800 of those have died. And that's a 34% death rate. So that's extraordinarily high, right? A third chance that you're going to die. I don't want those odds. Those are bad odds, right? That's a very high death rate. And 26 countries have had confirmed cases, but most of them come from Saudi Arabia and the Arabian Peninsula. Over 1,100 of the cases have happened there, but all the others are believed to have happened because people traveled to the Arabian Peninsula, got infected, and then went back to a different country. The United States has had no cases of MERS. And again, the animal origin is probably bats, and then transmitted to camels, and then from camels to humans. Since we don't have camels here, it's not likely that we'll ever have any unless it's brought in from someone who visited there and got infected while they were in the Arabian Peninsula. Now, SARS-2 is a pandemic, right? It's all over the world. Huge numbers are infected. Started in 2019 and continues today and will continue for a while. More than 44 million people have been infected all over the world. More than 1.1 million people have died. And the death rate is somewhat variable. The overall average is about 1%. And again, most people will say, 1%? Well, then I've got a 99% chance of surviving. So why am I worried about 1%? Well, 1% is 10 times higher than the percentage of deaths from the flu, right? Flu kills about 0.1%, right? That's the death rate for the flu. And we said that can be 40, 50, 60,000 people in the United States alone. So multiply that by 10. Right now, the United States has over 230,000. It's going to go up a lot more. So, and it's going to be about 10 times, right, the average number of people killed by the flu in the United States. So again, 1%, yeah, I like those odds. But if you have a pre-existing condition, you are more likely to die, right? So it's something to be worried about, especially if you care about your parents or grandparents, or you have, or you know someone who has a pre-existing condition. But the United States is the hardest hit. We have over 9 million infections here in the United States and over 230,000 deaths. And those numbers keep going up and up every single day. So we have more infections and deaths than anywhere else in the world. Now it's true, all data from all countries may not be accurate, especially from China, but still the United States has been hit hardest. And we'll talk about why at the end of the lecture. Currently, the animal origin is unknown, although it's probably bats, but they haven't demonstrated that conclusively yet. So it's still technically unknown where exactly SARS-2 came from.
I have a question. How could this be only 1% and much less people died in MERS, and that's 34%?
Well, far fewer people were infected with MERS, but the numbers who
Oh,
died were a larger percentage of that smaller
I
number.
see. Oh, I see.
So transmission, both SARS-1 and SARS-2 are respiratory infections, so they are transmitted by close contact, droplet infection, coughing and sneezing. Secondary mode of transmission is direct contact, usually with inanimate objects, which we call fomites. So, doorknobs, keyboards, those kinds of things, where someone who's sick touches it, then you touch it, and you stick your finger in your eye or up your nose, something like that, and that's how you get infected. But that's actually not a common way to spread SARS. The most common way is close contact coughing and sneezing, droplet infection. I know there are still people who, when they go to the grocery store and they buy their groceries, they come home and they try and wipe everything off, right, that they bought. I've never done that because, that kind of transmission is a very low risk, so I never worried about that. But some people did worry, and they're still worried about that, but it's really not necessary, to wipe down everything that you buy from the store, because that's not a common way to transmit it. It's mostly close contact and droplet infections, which includes simply exhaling. When you exhale, you release micro droplets, right, just from exhaling. So breathing is a way to spread viruses. MERS is primarily transmitted from camels to people. Person-to-person transmission is basically pretty rare and usually only happened with people who were severely ill with MERS. And so this was mostly in a healthcare setting where they transmitted it to healthcare workers. So only if they were seriously ill was person-to-person transmission, observed. And there are asymptomatic carriers of MERS, just like they are with SARS and even with the flu. But in the case of MERS, if you're asymptomatic, you are very low risk. That is not true of COVID. If you're asymptomatic, you're at significant risk of transmitting that to someone else. So the symptoms. A part of the problem is that most of the symptoms are the same ones you get with the flu. So mild symptoms will appear 2 to 4 days after exposure, and you may have fever or chills, common with the flu, a cough, common with the flu. Shortness of breath or difficulty breathing is not common with the flu, so that's sort of a red flag if you're having difficulty breathing. Fatigue, muscle body aches, headache, also common with the flu. But loss of taste or smell, that's not something that happens with the flu. So that is another red flag suggesting you may have COVID. A sore throat, congestion, runny nose, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, again, are common symptoms of the flu, especially in children with the nausea and the diarrhea. But it's the shortness of breath and the loss of taste or smell, right, that are very characteristic of coronavirus infection. If you go on to develop severe symptoms, you'll get things like viral pneumonia, acute respiratory distress syndrome, which is the result of severe lung inflammation, probably caused by a cytokine storm. You may have cardiovascular inflammation and damage, so you can get heart damage from COVID. You can get liver damage, brain damage, seizures, encephalitis from COVID. So these are the severe forms, right? Which again, mostly happen in people that have pre-existing conditions, but it's not entirely clear. There have been some patients who otherwise seemed perfectly healthy, no pre-existing conditions, and they died. So it's not that straightforward. We're still learning more and more about COVID, which is why we still need to be cautious and concerned. Long-term effects. We don't know yet for COVID because it hasn't been long enough, but SARS-1 did have some long-term consequences, like pulmonary fibrosis, which is permanent scarring of the lungs. And if you have pulmonary fibrosis, you don't get as much oxygen, right? It's harder to breathe. You have shortness of breath. Intense physical activity you're not able to do because you just can't get enough oxygen in. Osteoporosis, severe thinning of the bones leading to fractures. Femoral necrosis, right? The femur is the long bone of the leg, and in particular, the head of the femur would die, right, due to lack of blood flow caused by a respiratory virus. So we don't know yet what possible long-term consequences may occur in some people, but they happen in SARS-1, almost 100% chance it's going to happen in SARS-2, right? We just don't know yet. Comorbidities, also known as pre-existing conditions, increase the risk of severe complications and death. Things like obesity, diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, asthma, and pregnancy all contribute to an increased risk of severe complications and death from COVID. So prevention and treatment. Well, with SARS-1, there was no cure and no protective vaccine, but remember, it ended in 2004, and there have been no new cases since. Of course, now we're dealing with SARS-2, but it's not SARS-1. And because there were no new cases, there was really no financial incentive to create a vaccine, and so they stopped trying. I wish they had continued because that would have helped us right now. So basically, they just provided supportive care for the symptoms. So, giving fluids, anti-inflammatories for pain, treating symptoms as needed, and then hopefully you survived. Now, MERS, again, they provide supportive care for the symptoms. There is no vaccine yet. They have tried several antiviral drugs. None have worked. So they do recommend avoiding close contact with camels. If you eat camel meat, make sure you cook it thoroughly. Avoid drinking unpasteurized camel milk or camel urine, which is a thing in the Middle East. But these are ways that people are getting infected, and they should avoid doing these things. Now, SARS-2. Best thing you can do, wear a mask. Use personal protective equipment. Masks work. They're not 100%, but they help a lot. And the main purpose of the mask is to protect people from you. That's why you wear the mask, not to protect yourself from other people, although it does help. But if you're asymptomatic, you're able to spread the virus to other people. If you're wearing a mask, you help to protect those other people from you. So that's the main reason for wearing masks, is to protect others. Secondarily, it protects you. But the main point is to protect other people. So these people who choose not to wear a mask are showing contempt for everyone else. They don't care what happens to anyone else but them. And that's why we need to wear masks. Social distancing, at least 6 feet or 2 meters, is recommended. Further apart is better. Avoiding crowds. Washing your hands frequently. Cleaning and disinfecting high-touch surfaces like phones, remote controls for your TV, counters, tabletops, doorknobs, bathroom fixtures, toilets, keyboards, tablets, and bedside tables. So if you happen to live in a home with multiple people and one of them appears to be sick with anything, even just a common cold, it's important to disinfect these high-touch surfaces because it might not be a cold. Treatments. And now we're just talking about SARS-2. Supportive care is still done for symptoms. Ventilators. If you have a viral pneumonia and your oxygen, your blood oxygen has decreased, and they really want your blood oxygen to be at least 94% or higher, if it decreases below that, especially if it goes into the 80s, that's very serious. So they may have to put you on a ventilator. The problem with that, if you have to go on a ventilator, that means your condition is serious. And at that point, your chances of dying are about 30%. So going on a ventilator means you're basically in critical condition. You're extremely serious. And at that point, the death rate goes way up. Many vaccines are in clinical trials. Remdesivir is an antiviral drug that was used for something else, and they decided to try it with COVID. It has been approved for treatment, but how well it works is not clear, right? There are conflicting studies that have been done. Some people, it appears to help. Others, it does nothing. So again, it has been approved, but truly the data are not there to say for certainty that it really helps. Dexamethasone, a very powerful anti-inflammatory drug. It's used to reduce the lung inflammation. And so again, if you're having severe difficulty breathing and your oxygen content drops down, then dexamethasone can be very beneficial, right? But it's a very strong anti-inflammatory with side effects, including psychological side effects. Hydroxychloroquine. There are conflicting studies as to whether or not hydroxychloroquine actually works, whether or not it's beneficial at all. They just don't know. There are conflicting studies. Using hydroxychloroquine in conjunction with other drugs may prove beneficial, but there's just not enough data, right, to show that. But there are data to show that hydroxychloroquine can kill you, right? So that we know is a possible serious side effect of taking it. So again, we need to do controlled studies with placebos. And the problem is when you're in the middle of a pandemic, no one wants to take the time to do that. But that's the only way to know for certain if a particular drug will actually work, is to do a controlled study. That has not been done with hydroxychloroquine, at least not as far as I know. And the studies that have been done are conflicting. Passive antibodies, right? Convalescent plasma. So someone recovers from COVID. Maybe you can use their antibodies to treat someone who's in serious condition. The problem again is that there are conflicting studies as to how well that works. And the reason why is because we don't know how effective antibodies are against COVID. When we learn about the immune system, we'll see there are two major halves of the immune system, so two major parts. One is the antibodies, and the other is T cells. And it's possible that T cells are actually more important for controlling COVID than the antibodies are. So again, it's not clear whether using someone else's antibodies will actually be beneficial. right? Not enough studies have been done. We don't have enough data to know if that will actually work. Antibiotics like azithromycin, also known as a Z-Pak or Zithromax. So remember, we did say there are certain antibiotics that do have antiviral properties. Azithromax or azithromycin is one of them. And what it does is it has been shown to block entry of the virus into host cells, as well as stimulate the immune system to attack viruses. And so azithromycin has been used along with other drugs to help treat COVID. But again, we don't have any controlled studies to really show how effective it might be. Vitamin D, they have done some studies in patients. The ones who recovered from COVID had higher levels of vitamin D than those who died from COVID. And so maybe there's a relationship between vitamin D and COVID, and getting enough vitamin D may be very beneficial. Same thing with aspirin, a wonder drug. It's also an anti-inflammatory, so there may be some benefits to using aspirin. So again, we just don't know. There haven't been enough studies done. They haven't been controlled studies, right, to know what actually works. And it could be that different things work in different people. It may be best to use a combination of drugs and treatments. It's just we still just don't know enough. But we do know more now, which is why the death rate, although the number of deaths is still increasing, it's increasing at a much slower rate because we're better at providing supportive care and helping patients to survive until they can recover. But we just don't know enough. And we don't have good clinical trials of these drugs to know what works and what doesn't work. But in the middle of a pandemic, everybody wants something, right? They'll try anything. And that's a problem, right? Because they try these things and they die. Controversies. You notice how the format of this lecture is different than my other lectures, and that's because this format is what I use in my course called Understanding Viruses, which is not being offered in the spring. But I set up my lectures and I always end with controversies because there are always controversies with the scientists, with society, with the treatments. There are always controversies, and this is no different, except that there are a lot more controversies, and we're going to go through many of them. But with SARS-1, the major problem was China and their failure to release accurate and timely data. That was a problem back then. It's always a problem and still a problem now. But with SARS-2, that's where we have the most controversy. I'm not bothering with MERS because MERS is not a problem here. But again, we have data from China that are probably not accurate, and there's no way to know for sure. Health equity. Black and brown Americans are disproportionately infected with COVID and disproportionately die from COVID. And that has to do with the quality of health care that they can get, right? So many people may not have access to quality health care. Their life situation, maybe they live in homes with many people, so infection is more common in that environment. When it comes to jobs, many jobs cannot be performed remotely, right? So these people, in particular low-level workers, they have to go to their job to work, right? There's no way to do what we now, right? You can't use a computer to provide health care. The police can't use computers to, monitor everything and to deal with people. Your trash can't be picked up by a computer, right? Your groceries. Well, you can order your groceries on the computer and have them delivered, but someone has to deliver them to you, right? So transportation is involved, right? Restaurants have been hit hard because it's all based on people, interacting with people. Manufacturing, you have to go to the factory, right, to build something, to create something. You can't do that remotely. So many jobs, if not most jobs, cannot be done remotely. And so those people have no choice but to go out and interact with other people, and that puts them at higher risk. Conservatives, disbelieving or distrusting experts. And for a long time, conservatives had waged a war on science, refusing to believe scientific evidence and scientific data. And that's been true of global warming. It's true of COVID, how prevalent it is, the risk, how many people have died. There are just certain people who create their own reality, and that's all they want to believe, right? They don't accept facts, they don't accept evidence. Accusing scientists, especially Jewish scientists, of profiting from drugs and vaccines. And this has happened multiple times throughout history. Currently, it's happening with Dr. Fauci, who is a nonpartisan. He's a neutral individual here. And yet there are crowds of Trump supporters chanting, fire him, right? And there have been conspiracy theories that he's profiting from these vaccines. And it's all garbage. It's all nonsense. But this has happened in the past with scientists like Robert Koch and Ehrlich, the same kinds of things. They were accused of profiting, right, from drugs or vaccines that they had created. There are at least 2 Republican senators who were accused of profiting by selling stocks and or buying stocks in healthcare companies, companies that manufacture PPEs, after they had a coronavirus briefing. So this was a private briefing just for Congress before the public was informed. And these people decided to profit, right, by selling and buying stocks. There have been many, many conspiracy theories. I'm not going to go into them all here just because there's way too many of them. Misinformation and disinformation promulgated by President Trump and his administration. The incompetence that has been shown, especially with appointing unqualified sycophants. What's a sycophant? It's a fancy word. What's a sycophant? You've ever heard of sycophants? Nobody knows what a sycophant is, or you're all Googling it right now. A sycophant is a kiss up, right? Someone who likes to kiss someone else's butt, right? So when you appoint sycophants, they only tell you what you want to hear, not what you need to hear. Negligence, right? Deliberately downplaying the dangers of COVID for political reasons. For Donald Trump, it's for his re-election. Now, ever since President Bill Clinton, the federal government has had pandemic response plans. Ever since Clinton, George W. Bush modified and updated those plans. Barack Obama modified and updated those plans. And Barack Obama even created a pandemic response team. What did Trump do? He eliminated that team, and he completely ignored all the pandemic plans that were there. He just ignored them. When it comes to where the infections came from, the spread here in the United States, most infections probably came from Europe, not from China. So President Trump's travel restrictions on China were not effective because even after he banned travel from China, around 40,000 people came from China to the United States. after travel was banned. Where they really needed to ban travel was from Europe. That did not happen for a while. And by then it was too late. So most of the infections in the United States are believed to have come from European travelers or people traveling from Europe back to the United States. And that's how they brought it here. So not from China, although 40,000 people came in from China, it's probably mostly people coming from Europe. Failure to mandate universal mask wearing. There are still people in this country that refuse to wear masks. And we've already talked about the importance of masks. They're not 100% protective, but they are one of the best defenses that we have. Failure to enact the Defense Production Act. So this is a law which would have given the president the authority to require businesses to produce personal protective equipment and other equipment necessary to fight COVID and protect the country. And Trump never enacted, right, the Defense Production Act. And there are many other things that I could talk about, but I'm not going to. And I know this sounds like I'm being political, but you can research and look up everything that I've talked about and find out for yourself. Now, when it comes to comparisons, the 1918 flu killed about 675,000 people in the United States. So that's a lot. Hopefully, COVID does not kill as many, but don't be surprised if it does. And this for comparison with the wars, because the news media likes to make these comparisons where we can see how many U.S. soldiers died in the war and compare that to the number of people who have died or will die from COVID. And we can see that, of course, a lot of these wars are relatively, well, important for us, like the Revolutionary War, but only about 4,400 people died. War of 1812, 2000, the Indian Wars, the Mexican War. The big ones, the Civil War, World War II, right? So we've already surpassed the number of people killed in World War I. Remember, many of those soldiers died from the 1918 flu, right? Not the actual war. But we see how many people we've lost in wars and how many people we've lost, right, to COVID right now. COVID is really doing a lot more harm, right, than the wars did. So questions or comments?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
People who say they got COVID twice, and I know we talked about how it takes like a few years for a virus to mutate. So what does that mean? Did they get a different
Well,
COVID?
that's sort of in general, but the more people that get infected, the greater the chance for mutation and different strains to emerge. So it could be that those people, and it's just a very small number so far that have been documented to have gotten it twice. It could be that immunity is just not very long lasting. It just doesn't last very long for whatever reason. Or it could be that, there's one strain of COVID-19 circulating and they got the other strain.
Oh, I see. But all right, so you're saying that the first time they got it, their antibodies didn't last long enough to fight it the second time?
Right, that's one possibility. Or they got a different strain, right, the second time.
And those first antibodies wouldn't have helped the second strain?
Right, right.
Oh.
And that always creates a problem for vaccines, right? Because if there's more than one strain, you need to find something common, right, to all the different strains so you can target that one commonality. Or you make a vaccine that contains more than one strain in the vaccine. So, but there are different types of vaccines that are being created, so it's possible that we may be able to receive more than one vaccine, to provide the best possible protection. But there
Right.
are
And
more.
then, oh
Yeah,
yeah,
go ahead.
sorry, go ahead. I was just gonna ask, so SARS-1 just ended, it just
Yep,
stopped?
yep. It just kind of burned itself out. No more transmissions, and so there were no more hosts, and the virus just died out.
And because COVID now is spread so much, is that
Yep,
unlikely to happen?
yep. That's very unlikely. It's still possible. I, that's basically what happened with the 1918 flu pandemic. Is that the most susceptible people were infected and killed? The ones left behind, were not as easily infected or killed. And then with fewer hosts, it was harder for the flu virus to be spread. But in order for that to happen, a lot of people have to die, right? 675,000 people in 1918. I don't know what the population of the United States was, but it was probably less than 100 million back then. Now it's 3 times that. So 1.5 million people dying was one projection. 1.5 to 2 million people dying is a worst case scenario like the 1918 flu. Hopefully, we do not reach that.
Hopefully. And then also, can pets get COVID?
There have been some reports of pets
Right.
getting COVID, but I don't know if it's been a serious infection for them. But it's not unusual for pets to be able to transmit certain viruses or catch them from humans, but it's not typical. But since COVID infects bats and then civets, it's not you know unheard of to be able to infect a dog or a cat or something like that.
I see. Thank you.
But your dog will still love you anyway. Any other questions or comments? Most of you are pretty quiet. Nope, nothing. Okay, then we'll start lab at about 1:30. All right,
Thank you.
I'll see you then.